Good morning and welcome to Blain's Morning Porridge. It's March 27th, 2026. Let's talk about the economic implications of the Iran war. And let's start with a quote. Armchair generals talk about tactics. Soldiers worry about logistics. Now, the cost of Trump's war in Iran is truly extraordinary. 1 billion a day plus. War stocks are being consumed at an incredible speed. A request for an additional 200 billion of funding is in the works in the US. The nature of war has changed, and it could prove phenomenally destructive, expensive, and ruinous to winners and losers alike. Meanwhile, the economic outcomes of the war remain in the balance. Now, when I was a very young man, the global bond markets were a single column buried in deep in the second section of the Financial Times. On Monday, my boss reckoned the Euromarkets could see a 1 billion issuance week. And it happened. We were stunned. Such a huge number, $1 billion. Unimaginable. Now we throw around $1 trillion like it's normal. One writer on financial markets to whom I pay attention is Torsten Slok of Apollo. Earlier this week, he wrote the ballooning $2 trillion US budget deficit plus the $10 trillion of US debt that needs to be rolled over, plus rising hyperscale AI infrastructure issuance means investment-grade supply of over $14 trillion this year, and that poses the risk of a bear squeeze on rates and credit spreads as supply overtakes demand at a time when the Fed is thinking about preemptive rate strikes against inflation and the Hormuz Energy shock threatens global recession. And if you want to really horrify yourself, open the scariest page on the internet, the US debt clock. Play around with the time machine function, see how quickly it's rising. 125% debt to GDP. Ouch. 120 years ago, the UK was the dominant global power and global hegemon. Today, the OEC dismisses the UK as the most vulnerable economy to the current energy shock, hence most likely to see a bond crisis, which already threatens to metastasize through the economy. And before you start blaming Energy Secretary Ed Miliband, the UK's energy security is a result of long-term folly, not short-term mistakes. There could be trouble ahead. When bond markets wobble, everything else tends to fall. A global financial crisis would play straight into Iran's war objectives. Alongside the energy shock, the inflation risk, and worries about deeper geopolitical conflict, the war in Iran is costing the USA about $1 billion a day in war stock munitions. And according to the Wall Street Journal, over $2 billion in expensive equipment, including 3 F-15s, shot down by an overly keen Kuwaiti pilot, a damaged F-35, a couple of KC-135 tankers, and 2 very expensive radar systems taken out by Iran missiles have been written off. That number will rise as the pace of operations continues to run hot and planes and pilots get tired. And just take a look at the absolutely exhausted US Gerald R. Ford, the aircraft carrier which has been on a 9-month deployment and is currently under repair in Crete after an internal fire left much of the crew with nowhere to sleep. There is a fascinating story on the carrier's multiple problems on Bloomberg this morning. Meanwhile, the US military has requested 200 billion. Excuse me, I have a sip of coffee. The US military has requested 200 billion of additional funding to fight the war, ringing alarm bells in Congress and Wall Street. That cost will rise even higher when Trump commits ground forces, and this morning's news of a 10-day period before energy infrastructure attacks are resumed looks like it's there to give time to surge further troops to the region. While the pace at which the US and Israel have burned through offensive war stocks has been extraordinary. Even more dramatic has been the increased demand for Patriot and THAAD missiles to defend the Gulf states. All in all, having the most effective military on the planet and then actually using it is proving very expensive for America, and that has consequences. Why? Well, Iran is fighting a highly asymmetric war. It is absolutely broke, dependent on Russian and Chinese largesse. It can't challenge the Americans for air supremacy on the oceans or, as we may discover very soon, on land. If the US Marines on the USS Tripoli and the 82nd All-American Airborne Division assault Karg Island, they will do so with shock and fury, very effectively, and no doubt overwhelm whatever Iran is prepared to sacrifice. But that is what Iran plans. The Revolutionary Guard, which effectively runs Iran, has limited options but to fight, and has adopted a Fabian strategy, sopping up the bombs, attriting US war stocks, and keeping markets nervous in the hope of economic damage will cause the Americans to back off. Now, there are concerns they are hoarding their more sophisticated missiles, biding their time to strike harder blows should Trump walk away after declaring a hollow victory. There is a rising consensus that to win, all that Iran has to do is not lose. Now, not everyone agrees with that. Iran is anything but a perfect state, and the regime, as I've experienced myself in negotiations 10 years ago, is riddled with corruption, perhaps its greatest vulnerability. Now, there are senior US figures, not all of whom are Trump supporters, who believe the Iranian regime is close to collapse. Some expect a mutiny by the army, that's the Artesh. Some think the dramatically worsening economic situation into the summer will trigger the people to rise up again and overthrow the regime. Or maybe a hardline IRGC pragmatist will seize control and do a Venezuela deal whereby he gets the oil money to keep paying the Revolutionary Guards and Trump gains effective control of the Gulf. None of these would be bad outcomes. Removing Iran's state sponsorship of regional terror could enable the long-awaited golden age of Middle East prosperity involving all the various nations that are there. Unfortunately, it now appears the Iran war is binary. If Iran caves, great news all round. But if Iran does not cave in, then we have a long-term global energy shock, and the outlook for the Middle East is particularly bleak under such a scenario. If the Iran regime doesn't break and remains entrenched, it could raise serious doubts as to the sustainability of the Arab states in light of their domestic spending excesses and their infrastructure vulnerabilities to attacks on communications, like the Straits of Hormuz, and especially water facilities. Thus far, I've not seen much commentary on just how vulnerable Dubai's property markets would be to a wounded but unbeaten Iran, or how Saudi's ownership of global sports plays out if Iran decided to provide extra fireworks for an F1 race. What happens if Trump decides he's won and leaves the region still in turmoil? Would China step in to broker a peace and cheap oil with the Gulf states, thus securing them as allies? That's perhaps the real threat to Europe. Its long-term vulnerability to Middle East oil and gas could take a decade to correct. What we do know is that the Iran war is not anything like the spectacularly clinical Special Forces raid on Venezuela's presidential palace. And that's because the whole nature of modern warfare has changed, as the Russians discovered in Ukraine. If we see boots on the ground with the Americans attacking, the Americans will experience just how much drone warfare has changed the equation, especially in terms of first-person view FPV suicide drones. Now, the Americans are currently discovering that a modern war is phenomenally expensive, and that's going to change the way that war is fought. Last year, my colleagues David Murrin and Tony Beinstock were setting up Spitfire Strategic Capital, and they gave it a very simple mission: to invest venture and growth capital into innovative, adaptive, next-generation defense platforms that accelerate the development, production, and swift deployment of decisive, war-winning weapons and the support systems that tip the battle space in favor of the West and allied nations, with the ultimate goal of re-establishing full-spectrum deterrence. Now, people are listening to that message, and it is changing the way that we invest in defense projects. Spitfire understood the new rules of logistics. Use what is good enough and can be delivered today. And today, the Americans have learnt from the Ukrainians, introducing an internal drone market where their warfighters can order what they need from an Amazon-like market. That has proved spectacularly successful for Ukrainian combat brigades, and I think will be a major improvement in how the Americans fight with drones. The result of this war and how expensive it has been is going to be a massive shift in military demand. Good is now good enough. It's a matter of the systems and weaponry that can be delivered fast enough to do that job that needs done now. It takes months to build a Tomahawk, a Patriot, or a THAAD, and if you need something cheaper and swifter to deliver the defense that is needed now, then cheap is good enough. That changes the whole defense investment equation, and to be in front of it, you need to be talking to Spitfire, which I know sounds like naked self-promotion, but I genuinely mean it. You need to understand how the battle space is changing. Earlier this year, the US Defense Department identified 6 critical tech areas where they will sprint to deliver advanced capabilities to warfighters rapidly and at scale. They include applied artificial intelligence, biomanufacturing, contested logistics, which is the art of making sure that the enemy can't destroy your logistical chain, quantum and battlefield dominance technology, scaled directed energy, and scaled hypersonics. Their aim is to deliver the greatest impact, the fastest results, and most decisive advantage on the battlefield. All in all, not that different to what we're doing at Spitfire. At Spitfire, we have our own list of priority investments, and if you want to find out more about how defense investments are changing and how to address the costs of avoiding war by being prepared to fight it without exhausting the economy, then give me a shout. I'll be delighted to put you in touch with the principals and describe what we're investing in and where we see the future. Anyway, out of time today, but before I go, just let us remind ourselves that there are very few examples of air power winning victories. It looks like we are going to see this develop into a ground war, and that means it's likely to last longer. Anyway, on that sad thought, I've got to go back to my day job, but have an excellent weekend. You can find the Morning Porridge on www.morningporridge.com, and if you sign up, you'll get it delivered to your email every morning. I don't know what's going to happen over the weekend, so I have no idea what Monday morning's porridge will be about. Thank you all very much for your time, and thanks.